Had the builders of a new Boston in the 1960s had their way, right now I would be standing in the middle of the Southwest Expressway, a thoroughfare, a highway that was going to connect Route 93 in downtown Boston and the Mass Turnpike with Route 95. It was an ambitious plan to make the highway infrastructure of Boston sufficient for the needs of the automobile. Building it would have required leveling neighborhoods from the South End, parts of the Back Bay, Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, to connect with Route 93 south of Boston. Community activists, people who didn't want their homes taken, people who knew what it would be like to be living next to a major interstate highway, protested, objected, and in 1970, Governor Frank Sargent did something unprecedented. He said there will be no more highway construction in the city of Boston. That stopped the Southwest Expressway. But then for the next 20 years, there's a question, what to do with this land we have cleared for the expressway? And two things happened. One, the Orange Line was rerouted, so it now goes through the concrete canyon created to accommodate the Southwest Expressway. And the other is that this parkland was opened up on the site of the expressway, a parkland that connects downtown Boston by way of the South End with Roxbury and Jamaica Plain by way of a bike and walking trail. So Karilynn Crockett, historian from Boston, PhD from Yale, and you've written about the Southwest Corridor Project.
I have. Quite an amazing story.
It is.
So welcome to the Southwest Corridor Park. A pretty tremendous memorial and testimony to grassroots activism and residents from all over the city and outside thinking about a new vision for what Boston could look like in the future.
Yes.
So we are in the future, basically, of the 1970s. So this was supposed to be a highway.
That's right. That was a much different vision for the Boston future.
Much different vision. And so essentially in 1948, there was a plan to create a system of highways across Massachusetts, and right through here was going to be an extension of I-95 called the South End Bypass that would bring suburban folks through the city into downtown for work, for shopping, for all this. It was true for Boston coming up with a new highway plan, but certainly for cities all across the country. We're really trying to figure out how to get cars from one place to another, how to get suburbanites back into the city.
And there's a lot of federal money available to help them do this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the fact that we can even walk right here is pretty significant, pretty
and we can talk
dramatic.
to each other.
And we can hear, and we can see, and you can see there's lots of people walking to work, walking for recreation. It's beautiful.
And we can imagine what it would have been like with a highway cutting through the neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the people didn't expect that they would be able to stop this.
No, which is the best part of the story to me, is that through constant organizing, people were able to make a difference, but no one thought it was possible.
No.
So people who were on the ground that I interviewed, looking at the archives, looking at newspapers, you can see that people just did not think that it was possible to stop the highway, but they felt that they had no choice. They had to get up and say something. And it was definitely part of sort of this 1960s moment. There's so many liberation movements at this time, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, women's liberation. All these people just felt very activated and very skeptical of plans that didn't include them. And so this particular moment of change making was really benefiting from a lot of other national liberation movements. So the Boston anti-highway movement that was able to be successful and gives us the Southwest Corridor Park today really fed from a bunch of different movements from all over the country and organizers who said, you know what, no, we can do better than this. So this is the result.
You force things back to the drawing board. Absolutely.
And so actually it was significant because it made a change in national transportation law.
How so?
So basically, the organizing for the anti-highway movement in Boston starts in the 60s, right? And then by 1970, Governor Sargent says that the highway has to be we're going to stop, we're going to study it, we're going to think about it. 1972, there's a basically cancellation of the highway planning. And then in 1973 is there's federal transportation law that has a new, basically a clause in it that's called the Boston Highway Provision. and it allows for federal transportation dollars that were basically to be used for highways, to be used for public transportation. And a lot of that came out of the Boston organizing. So originally the provision was called the Boston Provision in honor of the organizing here. And what it did is it allowed many metropolitan regions all over the entire country to get federal dollars for public transportation projects. And it was unprecedented.
Amazing, yeah.
Because of the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, you could get federal dollars for road building. Not a problem. But there were no federal dollars for public transportation. So the money that we got in Boston to make the new Orange Line, to kind of help make this park, was also able to be tapped by other cities across the country, more than a dozen, and really change downtowns in those areas so that they weren't just flooded by highways, but there was more public transportation and pedestrian access, which is amazing. So Boston folks have a lot to be proud of. Yeah.
They do, yeah.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
So Boston has a lot of different influences in American history and world history.
Right, and certainly this as an example of planning history, of transit-oriented development, before that was a term that was actually even used for development, of rethinking city making. And this is it's a linear park. It's about 4.7 miles this park goes across the city. And it was created at a time in the country where people weren't really making new parks. And this is the 70s. Cities were scary, supposedly. Parks were scary. But residents were saying, we want to think about kind of open space and gardening and walking. And it was very unusual at the time. So really marks the beginning of kind of like an urban renaissance of thinking about open space and gardens and walking and all that. So quite significant on many, many local levels and certainly national, right?
Yes. And it does connect. There's now a lot of different communities, different people.
Many different neighborhoods. So we're walking through the South End, Back Bay. You're going to go through Roxbury. You go through Jamaica Plain. It takes you on into Hyde Park even. And a really significant story in terms of reconnecting these neighborhoods at a time where the city was quite divided.
Yeah.
So the timeline of this is coterminous with the Boston busing story, right? Quite a different story of how the city was really divided and really conflicted about how to think about its residents living together and sharing the resources of the city. So two very different stories happening at the same time, but giving you really deep insight into what the people of Boston thought about the future of their city and its possibility. Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you for telling this story.
No, well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful.